we have had the honor of listening to a lot of wonderful history lectures over the last several months, taking us through a sweep of different lessons into the chapters of world history and the battle between oligarchical in opposition to Promethean humanist movements, going back to Plato's battle to save the soul of ancient Athens and keep it from falling into the trappings of empire, to Cicero's battle to keep and revive the better traditions of the Roman Republic before he was taken out and Rome took a very different path, to the Renaissance period and the great leaders of Dante Alighieri, who set the foundations for what later became, a few generations later, the Florentine Renaissance, and the battles of Jonathan Swift, of the great English humanists of the 17th and 18th century, who did battle against the glorious revolutionary takeover that installed the Bank of England and really turned away from the Thomas More Erasmian traditions of Britain that were still being held on to, and that fell apart after the death of Queen Anne. So we've had a chance to look at these different chapters in history with a special focus on the American system and what was really special about the political economy and the idea of natural law that arose with the American Revolution, especially with Alexander Hamilton's formulation of the national banking system and of the American system that people like Anton, like Nancy Spanis, like Jerry have written about extensively. And we've had the honor of listening to all of their speeches. So today, we're taking it through the same universal history lesson is being approached through yet another lens. And we have the honor of having Martin Sieff, a longtime friend, a veteran, award-winning correspondent for the Washington Times, who's reported from over 70 countries around the world over the years, and really is just a wealth of experience and wisdom. And Marty has done some interesting work that I found very enlightening on a certain period around Teddy Roosevelt, and looking at some of the lessons and failures, moral failures and insight failures that humanity faced at the turn of the last century that got us into things like World War I that was otherwise totally avoidable. It's really, really interesting to see how in today's world, how easy a fall into a new world war could actually happen when you take the lessons of Teddy Roosevelt seriously and what was shaping the world in his time. So without further ado, I will give the stage over to Marty. And by the way, after when Marty is finished, I'm going to field questions, and anybody who has a question can just write in the chat area. If we have one, we don't have a chat area again. I screwed up. Okay, send me a message personally, and I'll call upon you to talk to Marty. Okay, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you. I came to this issue in two different directions. It's been a matter of fascination and increasingly appallment for me for many years. And I devote a large chunk of my 2015 book, Cycles of Change, not of the whole book, but of the chapter on the progressive era, to this whole issue of the paradox of Theodore Roosevelt and World War I. But informing this is something in my further background. I was with the Washington Times from 1986 to 1999. I've been based in Washington and been overwhelmingly, primarily a Washington political correspondent as well as a foreign correspondent, incredibly for more than a third of a century. And I've seen many changes in the political culture and psychology of the city and the country over that period of time. But during the Reagan administration and the George W. Bush administration, both of which I covered closely, and in my early, more naive years, I had on the Washington Times, I had very strong access to people serving in the Reagan administration at the time. I quickly noticed a very fascinating piece of iconography. And that was that whenever you went into the offices of the most gung-ho, militaristic, and even innocent, if you could call them that, in certain respects, members of the administration, the people who really believed in the evil empire, who really believed in manifest destiny all the way, you always saw the same portrait on the wall in their own personal office, their personal icon, Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt. He inspired them, and he inspired the George W. Bush people too. You did not see that in the last 4 years under President Trump. There were, in fact, on the defense side, there are quite a lot of people, including Esper at the Pentagon and Pompeo, most of all at State and the CIA, who do still subscribe to that view. Because the president, for all his genuine, and I've been a Trump supporter and still am, through thick and thin, from the very moment he came down that escalator at Trump Towers in 2015. But he, of course, stood for explicitly from the beginning a repudiation of mindless militarism and overextension everywhere. But at the same time, he had an innocence, worship and idealism of the popular militaristic culture, which is why one after another he appointed disastrous people to run the Pentagon and run the State Department, and one after another, and of course his national security advisors, especially that vile idiot Bolton, and one after another, he wakes up to the fact belatedly, much too belatedly. And Jim and I in particular have discussed different aspects of this repeatedly, this extraordinary naivety. Where does it come from? It comes from popular culture in America, the perception again of just as, Americans, everybody loves black hats and white hats, but Americans, I think, are much more prone to them than other people are. But when I was a boy, as they say, all those endless, not just decades, but generations ago now, and studying American history at Oxford, and first coming over here, Teddy Roosevelt was a forgotten figure. It was Franklin Delano Roosevelt who was regarded as the great savior of civilization and the great role model, and greatest president apart from Lincoln and Washington that all should aspire to and follow. This was certainly the view of my own teacher and mentor, Isaiah Berlin, who again was not an ivory tower innocent, but had spent World War II at the British, doing important work for the British, reporting up trends in American policy from New York for the embassy in Washington, run of all people at the time by the Archipelago, Lord Halifax. And though Halifax had been an Archipelago of Hitler before the war, and Berlin was Jewish and strongly supportive of Israel, the two of them were lifelong friends and held each other in the highest regard till the day Halifax died, and Berlin attended his funeral, en passant. But the point is, where was Teddy Roosevelt in those years? When I was growing up from the 50s through the 70s, he was nowhere. He was seen, as I intend to represent him today, as an archaic joke and a bad one, and an embarrassment, even in his own time. The renaissance of Theodore Roosevelt as a political cultural icon in America can be precisely dated. It is when Ronald Reagan comes in and tries to turn the clock back. And I came to America during those years, and I was very indulgent about this because I never took that kind of nonsense seriously. But that was my weakness, you see, because I didn't realize how many other people did take that nonsense seriously. And coming from a generation of anti-war protesters, both against Vietnam and the grandchildren of widows who had been left widows for 50 years because an entire generation of British and French boys had died needlessly on the trenches in World War I. And if you look at the great British popular culture of the 1960s, which we might want to make a separate study of sometime, even in this seminar, you have so many anti-war plays, books, movies. The greatest anti-nuclear war warning movie of all time is made by the BBC, though they don't have the nerve to show it, in the early 1960s. It's made by an hour on a BBC budget, which is non-existent, and it's totally terrifying. And I've never let my own children and my wife see it because I don't want to terrify them so much. It is called The War Game. And I think you might even still be able to access it on YouTube, The War Game. And it is extraordinary what came out of Britain in those years. So coming out of that culture, that admirable humanistic anti-war culture of Britain in the 1960s, which remembered the horrors of World War I, and which had gone reluctantly to war against the very clear evil in World War II, but had no desire to repeat the experience fatally in a World War III. And to come to that to Washington, I didn't take the Reagan era seriously. My concern was that America would become too weak after its Vietnam trauma rather than to become too strong, which of course is exactly what happened. I didn't foresee how the 80s and the 90s, how even the Democrats would then become even more drunk with imperial hubris and power than the Reagan people had, and how that would lead to the nightmarish Bush people. And there's been no looking back since then. As we know, there's been no looking back since then. And through all of this, if you go back to where the root of this idea of war and righteousness come from, it comes from pre-World War I. It comes from Theodore Roosevelt. It comes from an attitude which modern military technology had already made obsolete by the beginning of the war, and which Roosevelt, of all people, should have known better, because he had negotiated the end of the Russo-Japanese War, which is really the second modern full-scale horrific war, the first one being the US Civil War. And Roosevelt, incredibly, well, I say incredibly because it was unexpected, he actually earned it at the time, won the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating peace between Japan and Russia in the Treaty of Portsmouth. And that was Portsmouth in the United States, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, I think, certainly not Portsmouth in England or United Kingdom. In 1905. He is the first American, I believe, and I stand to be corrected in this eminent, small but very eminent and select audience, and I do not say that ironically in the slightest, most respectfully, but I believe he's the very first American to win the Nobel Peace Prize, just as Jack London, of all people, bizarrely is the first American to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. There's no accounting not for American tastes, but for Nobel Prize panel tastes. So he could and should have known better. But of course, the reason he didn't was he was a figure of the 19th century. When World War I begins, America is in an enviable situation. It doesn't have to go to war. And it has a Secretary of State, one of the most maligned and despised, and therefore, of course, underrated figures in modern American history. And a very curious figure in terms of the kind of people who both hated him on the one hand and loved him on the other. And that was Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan. Now, Bryan was, at modern tastes, which he could be a very unpleasant racist. But at the same time, he had all the hypocrisies, but also all the genuine strengths and limits of being a devoutly Christian racist, which meant he loved the African-American people he simultaneously despised and thought incapable of independent government. Bryan was therefore taken aback by the genuine hate-filled racism of his own president, Woodrow Wilson, who was born and shaped by antebellum Virginia. And therefore there was this great gap between Wilson and Bryan in the first place. Now, there are three great figures I find writing my book, Cycles of Change, who dominate the first 25 years of the era of progressive America, from 1896 to 1920. And they are Theodore Roosevelt, after whom the era is usually named, and I follow convention with that, but with caveats, Woodrow Wilson, and Bryan. Bryan runs for the presidency 3 times as Democratic candidate. And he's actually very much a Donald Trump character. People either adore him or hate him, just as we've had Trump derangement syndrome in the last 5 years, TDS. For 12 years, America was stormed by BDS, Bryan derangement syndrome. The idea that if Bryan ever became president or a leader of the United States, all civilization would collapse. Now, did civilization collapse in the last 4 years? Did our economy collapse in the last 4 years? Did we go to endless uncontrolled wars with President Trump? To this day, I cannot get that through, and I'm sure all of you have had the same experience, frankly, with any liberal I know. I mean, their heads are bulletproof. He was lucky. We have the vaccine because my wife is an official at the FDA, so I know from her how the bureaucracy functions and works. If now that we are on the brink of vaccines on this business, we are on it because of Operation Warp Speed and Vice President Mike Pence and the president himself working overtime to break down the barriers for joint research and investment by US major pharmaceutical companies and by European ones, what have you. But no, if you talk to liberals, all they will say is, he had nothing to do with it. He had nothing to do with it. They don't know he had anything to do with it. None of them ever worked in the FDA. None of them are doctors or pharmacists. No, it's a matter of, again, Charles Fort, people believing what they want to believe in, living in their own bubbles, facts that are damned because they do not fit accepted and acceptable belief systems, right? But when you look at Trump and you look at Brian, you find, again, not just honorable men of great experience and achievement, being regarded as buffoons and worse than buffoons. You find that precisely because they hold honorable, sane, decent positions, they are therefore sneered at, and especially look at the way Trump is regarded as the betrayer of Western civilization because he wants to get us out of NATO and he wants to stop the eastward expansion of NATO. Hence the endless false accusations against Trump over the past 4 years, right? In the same way, Brian, as Secretary of State, is determined to keep the United States neutral and out of World War I. Wilson benefits from this. Wilson is not a particular neutral. Of course, the World War I hasn't started in 1912, 1913. Brian, ironically, leaves the administration. He resigns after the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 because he recognizes very clearly, far from being a fool or an idiot, Brian recognizes very clearly that Wilson's moralistic policies are going to bring the United States into World War I, and that would be a catastrophe. It was actually much less of a catastrophe, though it was a catastrophe, than it would have been because Brian, more than any other man, delays that catastrophe by a full 2 years, from April, May 1915 to April 1917. He delays it, as we shall see. Whereas on the other side, Theodore Roosevelt is determined to achieve it. Now, when World War I begins, there are two Theodore Roosevelts. There is what you could call in Freudian terms, the ego, the super ego Roosevelt, the intellect of Roosevelt. And Roosevelt did have a very powerful intellect. He wrote major books of history, which at least in the fashion of the time were accepted. I mean, he was no Freud, he was no, well, I think Einstein is ludicrously overweighted, so I don't want to regard him as a primary thinker. But he was not a great primary thinker. And he would certainly never challenge accepted paradigms. But among those who didn't, he was widely accepted as a first-rate intellect in his own time. He wrote works of history, he wrote works of travel, of geography, of nature and the environment. He was in his own way certainly an intellectual, and he churned out articles, both good and hideous, all his life at an enormous scale. And got paid for it, the lucky bastard, far better than any of us, I think, have ever done. But when you see at the beginning of World War I, there are two Roosevelts. One Roosevelt actually advises President Wilson and tells press people in press conference, and these are off the cuff remarks revealingly from him. It's not America's concern. We probably shouldn't go in at the moment. Let's see how things are going to work out. But there is also the subconscious Roosevelt, the instinctive Roosevelt, the real man, the id. And he says to one of the two best friends he ever had in his life, British ambassador to Washington, Cecil Spring Rice. And the relationship does not start when Roosevelt is president or when Rice comes to Washington. Rice was already Roosevelt's best man at his, back in the 1880s at his marriage to Ethel. He writes to him, I'll see if I can get the exact quote here. I marked it, I put a marker in one of my books. It's worth digging out just for the sheer sake of it. Hold on. Actually, I think I'll have to paraphrase it. But he says, oh no, here we are. He says to Spring Rice in the fall of 1914, when the monstrous insanity has just begun, your country is passing through the flame, and it will come out cleansed and returned to lofty and noble deeds. It is passing through the flame and will come out cleansed and returned to noble deeds. This is the slaughter of World War I. This is the hecatomb of 10 million boys and young men needlessly for nothing in the trenches of both Western and Eastern Europe. And this is how Roosevelt's seen it. By contrast, because the United States is mercifully out of the war, Roosevelt continues, those are my words, of course, not his. He says to Spring Rice, my country, by contrast, quote, is passing through the dirty yellow mud streak of safety first. The dirty yellow mud streak of safety first. What on earth is Roosevelt talking about? It's actually very clear what he's talking about. Roosevelt, first of all, is not a Christian or a conventional Christian. Neither was Winston Churchill. Neither are most of the great imperial Americans and Victorians. They were all Darwinians. The strong deserve to win. There is a difference between Roosevelt and his eldest daughter, Alice, on this, which even Edmund Morris, the most stupid and naive and hero-worshipping of Teor's biographers, works out. Teor is obsessed with righteousness, though he never defines what righteousness is. Righteousness is always going to war for whatever the cause of the moment is for Teddy Roosevelt. But Roosevelt is fond of writing what a manly endeavor war is, how human beings can never be filled and fulfilled until they've gone to war, until they've killed. And of course, he also believes it is the duty of the Anglo-Saxon master race to enslave for their own good. He doesn't use the term enslave, but to take over all the inferior races of the world, or at the very least, wisely guard them in their own interest, which they are incapable of doing for themselves. It's perfectly, the idiot is perfectly serious about this. Now, he's ambiguous at the beginning of the war. Privately, he's appalled that America is out, right? He says to Spring Rice and others, he writes to one friend in France, my dear fellow, you have no idea how much I envy you and your country for being in this great and noble and cleansing crusade, while we must stay out of it. But what tilts him in policy terms, and remember, he had stayed out of world wars as president of the United States. He had won the Nobel Peace Prize for a legitimate achievement, negotiating peace in East Asia. These were real achievements of the same man. But I finally realized the key to the two Roosevelts: the ruthless geopolitical genius who understands power and how to develop it and how to hold it for generations and even centuries, who has studied the Roman Empire, and the naive, childish, idiot Roosevelt. Well, again, there's two ways of looking at this. One is the Freudian way, which is I think, is superb. You have the intellect, the superego, and of course, he's fashioned his conscience to jump through hoops for it. And you have the id, the instinctive, childish Roosevelt. Cecil Spring Rice again, describing the President of the United States to a colleague who thinks he's an idiot. You have to understand the president is really a little boy who never grew up. That side of it. But there is another dichotomy in Roosevelt too. Roosevelt is a 19th century man who never wakes up to the 20th century. He charged up San Juan Hill. He did. He was brave. He was incredibly lucky not to be killed. But he was only up against a few dozen Spanish soldiers with bad rifles that were obsolete and usually jammed in tropical weather. So he survived, right? And 20 years later, during World War I, when he has been turned down for active duty on the Western Front, an action which undoubtedly saved his life for another couple of years, and more importantly, saved at least thousands, if not tens of thousands of innocent American boys' lives who would have been thrown to their deaths by his incompetence, had he been given the commission as a general he wanted. He writes stuffily to Secretary of War Newton Baker, who's actually a relatively competent choice in that position by President Woodrow Wilson. He writes to him and says, he humps and says, well, I won the greatest victory that this country has won since the end of the Civil War in the past half century at San Juan Hill. So why do you say I lack any experience of modern warfare? He doesn't get it. On another occasion, he's writing to Secretary of War Baker, and he says, I really think it would be useful if you would allow me to raise a regiment or even a division of horse cavalry for us on the Western Front. Horse cavalry on the Western Front, exactly. You've got it, Matt. I think all of you have. This is a man who doesn't realize when he is living. This is a man who doesn't realize he is a walking anachronism. And yet it doesn't bother him. Because from the moment the Lusitania, well, actually, it comes from even before that. As I said, when war begins, he feels America should come in on the war. He isn't even quite sure which side we should come in on, just that it's important we should be in the war for the cleansing experience of it. That's his initial reaction. But he says, in terms of the rights and wrongs of the war, he doesn't come out strongly on the side of the British. He thinks the only great outrage has been committed by Germany, but what is that outrage? The outrage is, as Roosevelt repeatedly says, the rape of Belgium, the fact that neutral Belgium is invaded by Germany. And Belgium is sweet, innocent, and democratic, he says. Now, this is 1914. As I mentioned before, I'm working on a book now called Unlikely Angels. Actually, I'd like feedback from any of you. There are a couple of chapters I could use additional input on, the ones on Sir Roger Casement, the great Irish Republican and humanitarian hero, and on Nikita Khrushchev, who builds the most destructive force in human history, but then also steps back from the brink in the Cuban Missile Crisis and devotes his last 2 years of power to a genuine effort in partnership with President Kennedy to try and bring the world back from the brink, which is why we've actually enjoyed our own lives for the last almost 60 years now. Lessons which are now almost totally forgotten and lost, which is an extraordinary story in itself. But in the case of Casement, Casement became the greatest, most famous humanitarian in the world, and is even knighted by the King Emperor of the British Empire, King George V, for exposing the first great genocide of modern times, the murder of 10 million innocent African Americans living in what is now Congo and was for a long time also called Zaire. Under Belgian control, though most of the mercenaries who did the killing and exploiting were actually British. But 10 million people are killed. This is almost twice the death toll of the anti-Jewish Holocaust in World War II. And it is an equivalent total to the 10 million Ukrainians who are slaughtered by Stalin and his communists in the Holodomor, the genocide famine in Ukraine from 1929 to 1932. It is the first great modern genocide and war crime. And it is carried out by and in the interests of Belgium. And it is only formally ended in 1908, 6 years before World War I begins. And it is only ended after Theodore Roosevelt has almost completed his 8 years in office as President of the United States. Did he not know about this? He might have chosen not to. He would not have cared. Because remember, he is also the author, the driving force behind the US occupation of the Philippines in 1897-98, and the murderous crushing of the Filipino national movement from 1898 to 1902, which Filipino historians put the death toll from that at more than 2 million. And the figure who directly presides over that is US Commissioner for the Philippines, William Howard Taft, who Roosevelt then promotes to become his Secretary of War, and then chooses as his successor as President of the United States, and turns against because he feels Taft is too much of a softy and a wimp on the world stage and the American stage for his taste. And Taft, of all people, then goes on to become Chief Justice of the United States and manages to acquit himself, though at least superficially, passively, though granted the bar for expectations then as now was not very high, to put it mildly. So Roosevelt saw what he wanted to see. And as far as he was concerned, crimes against Black, Asian, enslaved colonial peoples were not crimes and they didn't exist. This same Roosevelt also spearheads an extraordinary full-scale war against both the very living conditions, the history, and the entire cultures and races and religions of the Native American peoples across the United States. He appoints a Czech, German-admiring racist to run the Smithsonian Institution for more than 30 years till he dies. And this gentleman is responsible not just for suppressing the artifacts of the great civilizations of the North American world in the 3,000 years before Columbus arrived. He is also responsible for quite literally exterminating not the people, but literally ordering barges towed out to sea and sunk with hundreds of tons of Native American artifacts on board them. And this is an issue which has still not been sufficient, still virtually unknown. A couple of fine, very courageous alternative scholars have pioneered the work, and I hope to give them some more publicity in another upcoming work of mine, which is coming up too, which you've seen the relevant material, I think, Matt. Now, this is the same Roosevelt we're talking about, who wants to get America involved in the killing machine of World War I, even when he isn't sure what side we should be on. But no worries. Because by May 1915, Roosevelt knows exactly who we should be going in on the side of. We should be going in on the side of England and Britain, and we should be going in against the evil Germans. Now, why are the Germans evil? Well, they shouldn't have invaded nice, innocent Belgium for all its genocide. Again, the issue of the genocide of 10 million people in Africa doesn't come up because they don't matter. Right? No, it's because a German U-boat sank the British liner Lusitania in April 1915. And Woodrow Wilson is not at all pleased. 1,400 people die on the Lusitania, almost as many as died on the Titanic. Like the Titanic, the Lusitania is a British-built ship, which means they're both built badly. The Titanic sank only 2 hours after scraping an iceberg. It didn't even hit it. It just scraped the iceberg. And this opened up an enormous cut because the rivets, we now know, were built in my native city of Belfast with obsolete and rotting iron and not steel as they were supposed to be. And so they simply popped. There's endless incompetence with the Titanic. The Lusitania, by contrast, explodes. Now, why should it explode? It's a civilian liner. And ships usually don't explode. In World War II, Japanese and American aircraft carriers are repeatedly torpedoed and sunk in the battles of the South Pacific and at the Battle of Midway. And they stay afloat for days before they go under. They stay afloat for days. So why does the Lusitania explode at once? Well, it helps that it's happened to be carrying a massive load of British contraband, of weapons for Britain at the time, in defiance of the neutrality laws at the time, which are clearly understood. It also helps to know that the German authorities in New York City were well aware of this, and they actually published in all the major New York newspapers a formal warning saying that the Lusitania was known to be carrying contraband to Britain, weapons to Britain as part of the war effort, and therefore would be regarded as a legitimate war target. And this was in all the major newspapers in New York City before the Lusitania sailed. But of course, nobody paid any attention, right? Now, who ultimately took the decision to load the Lusitania with all those weapons? Not Teddy Roosevelt, but somebody else all of us here are very familiar with. Anyone want to venture a guess?
Franklin Roosevelt.
No, much better than that.
Okay.
Although close, because FDR was, of course, in operational charge of the United States Navy at the time as a highly energetic and outstandingly able Assistant Secretary of the Navy, right? But it was his opposite number in London who took the crucial decision. Winston Churchill. Churchill is half American. His mother is American, the son of a New York financier. And Churchill had traveled in America extensively in the 1890s. And if time permits, we can even go into this en passant, though it might be a separate subject. Churchill holds two positions in World War I in the British government. At the beginning of the war, he is the head of the British Navy, the most powerful and hands-on head of the civilian head the Navy has ever known and ever will. And he is a catastrophe in that role. He loses an entire fleet of battleships and other vessels. He loses several major engagements. He nearly loses political control of South America. He loses the Ottoman Empire from being a British ally to an ally of Germany directly in the war as a direct result of his own bungled actions. He's the catastrophe as head of the Navy. He's also a gambler. He's responsible for the Gallipoli catastrophe to a much greater degree than he ever admits afterwards. In fact, this is the reason he writes his war memoirs, The World Crisis After World War I. The central aim of this enormous 8-volume book of more than 2,000 pages is to, most of it is spent with Churchill making excuses for why one ghastly disaster he made after another was not really his fault. So he's kicked out of the government in 1915. But he's brought back in 1917 for a very specific reason. He is Britain's, what Albert Speer was to Hitler, Winston Churchill is to David Lloyd George and the British war government. He becomes their armaments minister. Minister for Munitions, that's his exact title. And in this role, he is an outstanding success. He has one huge ally in America. It is not Teddy Roosevelt, because Teddy Roosevelt all his life despises Churchill, largely because they're so alike, of course. You know, if you're a monster or an idiot or a horse's ass or both, and you look in a mirror and you recognize you're looking at a horse's ass, will you like what you see? Well, you will if you know it's you. But if you think it's someone else who just happens to be identical to you, and that is exactly the attitude Theodore Roosevelt had all his life towards Winston Churchill. The man is irresponsible, he's an adventurer, he's a warmonger. Sound like anyone you know? And he could never see this. He could never see this, right? FDR, incidentally, with rather more reason, doesn't like Churchill either. But when World War II begins and Churchill is brought into the British War Cabinet, Harold Ickes, I think it's in Ickes' diaries, asks the boss, FDR, the president, you know, you met him, didn't you, sir, during, back before the war? And the president replies, yes, I couldn't stand him. It was just after World War I. I thought he was a frightful bounder. And of course, after Churchill, by contrast, could not even remembering FDR, though they had been at a banquet together, which was not a wise move either. But of course, the hypocrisy of the great love for each other is generated afterwards. Now, back with Teor. As I say, when the war begins, Teor is determined to get into it. He isn't even sure which side we should be on, just as long as we should be there, because of the cleansing effect of war. This is a combination of conflicting cultural influences. The arrogance of being an American or English upper class elitist who reads childish boys' stories about, wonderful fellows charging off to war and what have you. And by the way, I don't think I've mentioned it in any of our discussions before, but I have to recommend most warmly to everyone here the most wonderful deconstruction of 19th century English American popular imperial culture. The Flashman novels by George MacDonald. Of course, Stephen, of course you would know them. But for those of you who don't, would you like to say it, Stephen? Rather, please go ahead.
Well, no, I'm laughing because he's such a lovable scoundrel, the main character.
That's what I adore, Flashy. Exactly.
Yes, absolutely.
But he also is throwing all this light on all the idiots around him. Here is a man who all he wants to do is grab the available ladies, usually gets his face slapped when he's young and drunk and pinching someone's bottom in the wrong place. Absolutely shocking and outrageous, we will agree, right? I don't think. And whenever there's a war, he wants to run for his life, and he's a healthy coward. But because war is so messy and chaotic, he always comes out of wars looking like the most gallant hero in England. So he wins the Victoria Cross. He's an advisor to Abraham Lincoln. He's the close personal friend of Queen Victoria. And it's all based on a lie. But because the image is so strong, you must realize these are some of the greatest comic novels as well as historical novels ever written. The Flashman novels, several set in the United States. And I cannot recommend them highly enough to deconstruct the idiot's world we are talking about here. But Winston Churchill and before him Theodore Roosevelt and Rudyard Kipling, of course, are all classic examples of this idiot's world, where England and America are always right, the empire is always virtuous and good, the Battle of Waterloo was run on the playing fields of Eton, there are no houses of prostitution serving the British Empire with Galician Jewish girls who have been kidnapped in their scores of thousands by their own co-religionists through the 19th century. Which was, of course, the reality of the case, the first great organized crime cartel in modern history, taking advantage of speed of light communications by telegraph and ships, is the Zwei Dagan, the two towers. And you'll find virtually nothing on the internet or almost anywhere else. But 104, the best research is being done in Israel by some feminist scholars right now. 140,000 pious Orthodox Jewish girls are legally kidnapped by being married to their respectable, apparently prosperous husbands who are simply pimps on the lookout for white flesh, and then are taken by them and dumped in the brothels of South America and across Africa and South Asia. And this goes on from 1860 to 1940. It's only the Holocaust or the communist takeover of Eastern Europe that finally ends it. And as is usually the case with ethnic crime organizations, we see the same thing with the Chinese triads, with the Irish gangs of New York, with the mafia. The primary victims of these monstrous outfits are always their own ethnic groups and their own co-religionists. That's always who they feed on first. It's parallel to having healthy industry being built up in a protected environment. And once it reaches a certain critical mass, it then mega-sizes and can start investing overseas as well, because you have some more profits than you know what to do with. And you can replicate your own success in your own country in legitimate industry and business in other countries. And the United States and the British before us have done that very successfully over the past 200 years. But it also applies with the way organized crime cartels get established and grow. And we see it now also with the Nicaraguans, with the Mexicans, with the Colombians. But they're following, it isn't that these people consciously take from each other. It's just that the same basic principles apply and are relearned by different groups and different generations. Now, again, I'm running off in different directions here, as you have put up with me before, and you all know I do. Thank you for your forbearance. In the case of Teor, when the Lusitania goes down, that's all Teor cares about. All Teor, and by the way, it was even a legitimate act of war because Churchill had commissioned this liner with 1,200 innocent civilians on board as an auxiliary cruiser in the Royal Navy. So technically it was a warship of the Royal Navy flying war flags. That's the first point. Secondly, the Lusitania explodes and sinks immediately. There's a recent book by Erik Larson, and Erik Larson writes lovely stories about my favorite subjects of all kinds. But unfortunately, as a historian, he's incredibly sloppy and ignorant, again and again. And here he solemnly comes to the conclusion that it was increased steam pressure that caused a particularly exceptional explosion here in the Canarder. Now that sounds so wonderful until you apply the simple basic lessons of history, experience, probability, and most of all common sense till you shave it away with Occam's razor. Because there is not a single other liner powered by either steam, coal steam power, or turbine gas engine, oil engine power in either World War or in the 20th century or before it that explodes that way. Not a single one. The ship exploded because it was crammed solid with munitions for Britain, and Churchill had approved it, and this is documented. And therefore, once a torpedo hits it in a calm, open sea in relatively warm water, it blows up, and only 300 or 400 people are saved, and 1,400 die immediately. The death toll is a little less than Titanic, but not much. Right? Curiously enough, both disasters are associated with the south of Ireland, just off my father's native city of Cork. But of course, that has no real bearing on anything, except I like to throw it in. Now, the Lusitania goes down and it does its job for Churchill. It mobilizes American outrage against Germany and it mobilizes Teor. William Jennings Bryan works very hard and successfully to keep America out of the war, and he convinces Wilson, but not totally. Wilson is not as bad as Teor, but basically they're very similar. They're both rigid, moralistic, holier-than-thou Victorian figures who are utter hypocrites and racists in their different ways, actually in similar ways too, overlapping ways. And of course, Teor hates Wilson, regards him as a wimp and a softy, which Wilson certainly is not. That's about the only thing you can say about him. But in Wilson's case, Bryan is horrified by Wilson's reaction because Wilson lectures Germany so much on the need for independence in the high seas. And Bryan, who again is regarded to this day in mainstream American historiography as a buffoon, as contemptible, exactly the way that if we avoid nuclear war, you can see them rewriting Trump has for the next 100 years. Bryan says, Mr. President, if you continue with lecturing the Germans this way, if you continue making this issue about the way that the Germans have been using their submarines a central issue, we will be pulled into the world war and it will be a catastrophe for us. We will simply suffer the same destruction of civilization that the Europeans have already experienced. I paraphrase, but look him up. His own language is much more pompous, but also much more eloquent and much more carefully argued than mine is. Now, how is William Jennings Bryan remembered, if he is remembered at all in American popular culture today? There is, at the end of his life, shortly before he dies, he opposes the Darwinian theory of evolution and champions versions of creationism in the famous Tennessee monkey trial. And there is a movie made of this. And the movie is called Inherit the Wind. And it's a wonderful movie. It's very beautifully acted. I can't even remember who plays the liberal hero.
Spencer Tracy.
Yes, thank you. Now, the irony is, again, this is a version of reality. In reality, Spencer Tracy was an abusive alcoholic, a deeply troubled man who, because he was bisexual, and this, of course, had to be hidden within the mores of the day, they faked his supposed idyllic relationship with Katharine Hepburn, which, since she was gay, she was very happy for convenience to go along with. And she was a much more formidable and stronger personality than he was. So in terms of their partnership, it was certainly not a romance or a marriage. She always held the whip hand. But he always ended up playing these heroic, principled, humane, kindly, strong figures, which was the opposite of what he was in real life. An irony which incidentally endlessly amused Katharine Hepburn, who counted both John Wayne and Humphrey Bogart among her genuine friends. Right? But in the movie, and the play it is based on, William Jennings Bryan, and in the movie he's played by a wonderful actor, Frederick March, is a contemptible, soft buffoon who is humiliated in open court and immediately collapses of a stroke afterwards, and he well deserves it. That's the way he's presented in the movie. The reality, of course, could not be more different. First of all, Bryan ended the court case, a happy man. He'd won the technical verdict. He knew the liberal press on the East Coast were completely against him, but he dramatized an issue he really wanted dramatized. A couple of weeks later, surrounded by family and friends, he has one of his admittedly out of control enormous breakfasts, has a stroke, and dies very quickly, but peacefully and happily on the spot. But what was his case? During World War I, Bryan is appalled at the collapse of civilized values in World War I, and he is actually appalled by the Germans and what they're doing. The things that most appall Bryan are threefold. First, unrestricted submarine warfare, though he still believes America should not have gone to war over it. Secondly, using zeppelins and aircraft to bomb innocent people in open cities. Right? You can see what he would have made of what Curtis LeMay did to Japan in World War II, let alone the nuclear bombings. Right? And finally, the use of poison gas, the ultimate horror in Bryan's view. Right? Now, And he asks himself, why did the Germans do this? And he starts studying it, and he is a serious intellectual man. As of course in his own way was Teor. But Teor never asks any of these fundamental questions, and Brian does. And Brian comes to this conclusion, that it all stems from the teachings of one man, a man who is revered in Germany and who also Teddy Roosevelt revered, Charles Darwin, as interpreted by Herbert Spencer. Might makes right. The strong not only have the power to destroy the weak, they ought to do so. Now, this isn't quite the case with Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt's daughter, Alice, always makes fun of her father because she says he needs to have the excuse of righteousness before he does anything. And of course, he always manages to come up with a version of righteousness that suits him at the time. Whereas I don't bother with that nonsense at all. I think we should just exterminate the scum because they're scum to begin with. This is Alice Roosevelt's view of the world. Alice Roosevelt, incidentally, hates and despises President Warren Harding because he is a man of peace, because he is sitting in the seat her father had held and should have held again, and also because Warren Harding and his Secretary of State, Charles Evan Hughes, negotiates the very antithesis of a Teddy Roosevelt agreement. They end a major naval war race between the United States, Britain, and Japan in the Washington Naval Treaty of 1921, right? And Alice despises Warren Harding so much. She's practiced voodoo all her life, and she puts a death curse on Harding. And when Harding dies after only 3 years in office in 1923, actually of overwork, and he had a weak heart, Teddy Roosevelt's daughter goes around Washington claiming credit for killing him, right? Now, back in the war, as I say, it's May 1915, and this is the crux of the matter. Teddy Roosevelt has no doubt whatsoever. As a matter, he's found his righteousness, what his daughter is always making fun of him about, right? He's found his excuse for mindless action, for getting the headlines back from Woodrow Wilson. Since he split the Republican Party in 1912 and allowed Woodrow Wilson to become president by splitting the Republican vote, Roosevelt has become a has-been. Nobody pays any attention to him anymore. And as his daughter rightly and shrewdly observes, and other shrewd observers of the time, like the great political satirist, humorist, the author of Mr. Dooley, Michael Patrick Dunn, point out, Teddy cannot breathe, he has to breathe newspaper headlines. That's what he lives by. And suddenly he's got a new cause, that America can only be America, can only be righteous, can only lead the new century by immediately going to war against this enormous stain on Western civilization, the sinking of the Lusitania. So Teddy Roosevelt, this great realist, this great macho leader, has fallen into the English and British imperial Winston Churchill trap of World War I, when even Woodrow Wilson hasn't, though he's drifting in that direction. And William Jennings Bryan resigns as Secretary of State. And from then on, the entire efforts of British media influence in the United States are devoted to building up Teddy Roosevelt and to delegitimizing William Jennings Bryan as thoroughly as President Trump has been delegitimized, at least in the mainstream media over the past 4 or 5 years. And in the same way, he's a child, he's emotional, he doesn't understand history, he doesn't understand power, he doesn't understand how to throw millions of boys to their early deaths. And now we come to a crucial part of the issue. What would have happened if, as Theodore Roosevelt insisted, the United States had gone to war 2 years early in April 1915? We only go to war in April 1917. And there were those like the great historian Tom Fleming who argued that even then it's totally bungled and a complete catastrophe. While I'm enormously sympathetic with him, I, of course, as ever, have a very Irish and subversive thank you, Steve. I knew you would appreciate that. Bless you. Exactly, man. Right? Twist on this, because Newton Baker, Secretary of War, is actually not an idiot at all. He's a highly responsible man, but he's very thorough, careful, and cautious, and systematic. Above all, systematic. So a major US army is arranged for war. The Navy, thanks to Franklin Roosevelt, and the US maritime and shipbuilding industrial base is superbly ready. But we don't have a heavy armaments industry. We don't build our own artillery, which really is not a big problem because the French are by now overproducing their own artillery, and their 75 millimeter howitzers are excellent and are used effectively by the US Army. But worst of all, we don't have a modern army. We have no conception whatsoever of modern tactics. Now, you've seen this with Teddy Roosevelt. And in his 8 years as president, Roosevelt has appointed to the head of the army guys who rode up San Juan Hill with him. And their horses' asses, idiots, the whole lot of them. The whole lot of them, right? And you have in charge totally a more professional man in the army. But basically an American version of Douglas Haig, the great butcher of the British Army, John J. Hershey. Now, of course, today Pershing is a demigod as well at West Point and what have you. You can't say a word against him. But all of Pershing's military experience has been spent chasing Pancho Villa in Mexico. Up to 1901, the United States did have seasoned war heroes as president of the United States and running the executive branch. And the last of these genuine war heroes who knew what real war was about and had been decorated with great valor for it was William McKinley, who had fought at Chattanooga in 1864, who had fought in many of the latest, most bloody battles in the Western theater of the Civil War, who was very active in the Grand Army of the Republic all his life, and a man who fought as long as he could to oppose the pressure of Theodore Roosevelt and his friends to declare war in Spain in 1898. A man who did not want to go to war, a man who loathed war because he had actually been in real wars. And instead, that generation is replaced by a regressive generation, by a generation of war lovers who had never been to war, or like our heroes from the first Gulf War in 1991, thought that war was like scoring a hole-in-one in golf. You simply shoot down the Iraqi or Arab cowardly buffoons from a safe distance, and you're never injured or hurt or threatened yourself. And then we do what we want with them, and they will let us. That was the assumption, not so much in 91, because a genuine war veteran and hero for all the more negative aspects of him, George Herbert Walker Bush, had been a combat pilot in the Navy in World War II, had been shot down, had his, not co-pilot, but his gunner killed in action, though he was rescued, had after all that volunteered and gone back and flown more missions, which took the highest form of physical and a significant degree of moral courage for all his much more dark aspects as well. He had done these things, but we don't see that with George W. Bush. One of the most impressive things to me about President Trump is that he's opposed to major wars, even though he hasn't fought in them. Usually you find when people do fight in major wars or have had experience in Vietnam and what have you, they are the people most likely to want to avoid starting new ones. It's the Madeleine Albrights of this world who are the people who are the great fakers, or the neoconservatives. You know what the fathers of the neocons did in World War II? They all wangled their way out of the war, and they were all even opposed to the US going into war because they were communists at the time. They were basically wildly to the left, ultra-liberals or communists, and then they switched to become ultra-conservatives in the 1960s or early 1970s. I saw the same progression a couple of generations later in the 1980s in Britain, where people who I had known in my student years in Oxford and London as the most left-wing of people automatically switch overnight and become tremendous boosters of the Iraq War and NATO expansion and putting the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians and the Iraqis in their place. And of course, they're still like that today. Now, Teor had played at war, as we know, at San Juan Hill in 1898, and he had no idea that things had grown worse and that things had grown change. He should have, because he negotiated an end to the Russo-Japanese War, a war that cost more than 100,000 dead on both sides, an exceptionally bloody, horrific precursor to World War I. But all he can still think of in 1915 is we must go to war immediately. What would have happened had we gone to war immediately? The United States Army, when it went to war in 1917, did not even have any manuals for infantry combat or the use of artillery. They had no conception of putting artillery on the reverse sides of hills where they were much more likely to be protected by the terrain, most elementary precaution. They didn't even have enough spades or barbed wire to dig themselves in. And as I quoted to you before, Teddy Roosevelt envisages that the way to win the war is to raise a division of horse cavalry with himself at the head, waving his swords gloriously while they go out to be mowed by the machine guns. The British were still fighting that way as late as July the 12th, July the 16th, I think, 1916, or July the 12th. Look up, I stand to be corrected on the exact day there. I'm looking at the first day of the Battle of the Somme. 58,000 British soldiers are killed. More die later, but 58,000 British soldiers, which is quite literally 50% of the total immediate war dead of the United States in the whole of World War I, are killed attacking the German army at full strength on the Somme in July 1916, on the very first day of the battle. The battle still goes on for another 6 months because of the incredible stupidity and psychopathic, quote-unquote, determination of Sir Douglas Haig, a man, incidentally, who Theodore Roosevelt greatly admired, who was the commander-in-chief of the British Army at the time. Total British casualties in the Battle of the Somme alone are 500,000 men. 500,000 men in a single 6-month battle. And they gain a grand total of 10 miles in advance. At that rate, the war would still be going on in the 21st century, and they might be half the way to the Rhine by now. That is how it was going. Now, in American war dead, when we went into the war, because Newton Baker was so slow and thorough in preparing the US Army for war, Theodore Roosevelt fulminated against him. And it was certainly the case that as a result, the United States Army only enters the war in significant strength in the summer of 1918, 15 months after we declare war, and only 5 months before Germany collapses. And the effect of the American army in those 5 months is decisive, because the French are no longer capable of offensive operations. The British are, but have also been bled white. And the Germans have been exhausted because, as well as fighting the British and French to the finish, they've also wiped out Russia as well. So everyone else has been bled white. So the American army only has to face a German army which has been exhausted by 4 years of non-stop world war. Right? We're not talking about individual campaigns and then a 1 or 2 year breathing space, as happened at the beginning of World War II, and then being rotated back in, as was the way with our boys in the Pacific, and even to some degree in the European theater of operations. We're talking about Germany fighting with its full army, non-stop, without a break, for nearly 4 years. And the American army comes in with unlimited manpower, and we win. The war costs us initially 119,000 dead, which is bad enough. But in 1930, the Bureau of War Veterans comes out with an official figure that was buried and unknown for the next 70 years till the great historian Thomas Fleming comes up with it. And that is the official Bureau of War Veterans estimate in 1930 is that the American death toll in World War I was really not 118 or 19,000, but 460,000. Why the disparity? Was it a cover-up? No. Was it a mistake? No. Was it lies? No. It was because poison gas was used so widely in World War I. And hundreds of thousands of people who technically survived the war after being gassed had such damage done to their lungs that they died 40 to 50 years before their time anyway. The same phenomenon can be found in British and French war dead, and memoirs from after World War I and World War II, from the interwar period of the 1920s and 1930s. That's the main difference. There were two other factors. One key factor is very simply the great flu pandemic of 1918-1919 is spread by the war. And people who have been wounded by the war or just exhausted by the war are much more vulnerable to the flu pandemic. And as we see now, when you have viruses of one kind or another, they have different twists to them. And one of the great twists of the flu pandemic of 1918-19 is that much younger people die from it rather than older people. Older people die too. But you are much more likely to die for it if you were a child or a teenager or in your 20s than if you were in your 40s and 50s. This was true in my own family. My mother was one of 8 kids raised in poverty in industrial North Belfast. And she had a brother who, despite coming from a very poverty-stricken condition, was a very bright, loving, talented boy who went to university. And he was fooling around in as idiot students invariably do. And he fell off a ladder, not very high, but he broke his leg. And today it wouldn't be serious at all. But first of all, he got an infection, and there were no modern medications that you could take. And then the flu epidemic came along and carried him off. And the trauma of that was so great that my mother and her sisters still carried it 60 years later, in the late 1970s and 1980s. That's how long the shadows of loss and tragedy from war and from pandemic and disease can last in life. And there's a third factor, which actually didn't really apply after World War II or the Korean War. Penicillin had not been developed yet. Antibiotics had not been developed yet. So a lot of people with chronic wounds and conditions after World War I who could survive now and technically survived then, died in the years afterwards. So the American death toll, even when we only came in as late as we did, 460,000. But suppose we had come in 2 years early. We would not at first have listened to the French, just as the British did not listen to the French. The British never took combat lessons from the French, and the French only started applying successful combat lessons in 1917. The French had even higher death rates per capita among their troops than the British did. There is one great general in World War I on the Western Front. There are a couple of other actually very good ones on the Western side who are very improbable, and I can even touch on them if anybody wants me to. But without question, there is only one general who, in terms of his ability to kill Germans, preserve the lives of his own troops, and also have humane concern to protect his own troops, and who also comes up with battle tactics and strategies that actually work cost effectively and successfully. There is only one general. Anyone remember who he is? I want to mention him. A clue. Neocons don't like him. The great appeaser of World War II, Marshal Philippe Pétain, the winner of the Battle of Verdun, even more than Stalingrad, the bloodiest battle of all time, the greatest artillery duel in history. 1.5 million men killed in a killing area on both sides of less than 200 acres. It's quite extraordinary. I don't think any of you, and this audience in particular, needs to visit the ossuary of Verdun. I guarantee you not a single neocon or neo-lib ever has. And they should all be marched through there, preferably at bayonet point, because it is a collection of bones and skulls on a colossal scale, such as you cannot even imagine. And it's only a fraction of the number of people who died on both sides in Verdun, because Verdun was an artillery battle. Virtually everybody who died in it didn't die from the machine guns, they died from the artillery. But it takes the French 3.5 years until Pétain finally forces them to come up with sensible, humane battle tactics that preserve the lives of their troops. The British never do. We never do. We are lucky because the Germans are on their last legs, and when Pershing applies his bullish head-on tactics, and we forget the British are attacking at the same time. And unlike us, the British know how to use artillery. The British finally, there are a handful of British generals who actually know what they're doing on the Western Front. One is Sir Francis Plumer, a man who looks like an idiotic version of Colonel Blimp, big pop eyes, squeaky little voice, only 5 foot tall. He must be an idiot, but actually he's incredibly brilliant, humane, first class. He ends up, of all things, High Commissioner for Palestine, and is the only High Commissioner that the British have who keeps both the Jews and the Arabs, both of them, successfully in their place and prevents any wars or riots or bloodbaths breaking out from 1924 to 1928. Right, and the other one, even more colorful. There's also a Canadian general, and I stand to be correct. He's the most eminent Canadian general of World War I, and it's because he's just a low-caste Canadian that hasn't been to Sandhurst, the British Military Academy, or the right English public schools, that he's never allowed top command in the British Army. But he is actually utterly first class. And then there's an Australian general who's also Jewish, who isn't a soldier at all. He's an engineer who'd served in the reserve units. And by the end of the war, he's been so successful that British Prime Minister David Lloyd George is planning to replace Douglas Haig at last with him, with an Australian Jew, as the commander of all the British Imperial armies on the Western Front in 1919 for the next campaign. But it takes 5 years for these people to emerge. And there is one other first class and very improbable British commander. The man who is the head of all British artillery on the Western Front for the last year of the war. The man who takes the French conception of the creeping barrage, a technically very complex way where you adjust the range of your guns so you keep bombarding with heavy artillery and you keep the line of bombardment moving forward and your troops move in immediately behind them. It's very technically difficult and demanding to do. The British have only one general who can do it. Typically, he even improves the original French conception from Pétain. His name is Alan Brooke. He is chief of the Imperial General Staff through World War II, and he's a major reason we, as well as the British, won World War II. In 1942, Teddy Roosevelt, as led by George Marshall, won to attack Germany head on when the Wehrmacht is at the height of its power in 1942. This is a pure Teddy Roosevelt conception. It is stopped head on by one British general, Alan Brooke, who says, well, I have fought the Germans in 1940 in France, and you haven't. And in fact, he brought back the only British units that were not totally destroyed by the Germans. He brought his units back in one piece, and he commanded the rear guard at Dunkirk that made the rescue of 1/3 other men possible, right? And he later on appoints Montgomery and protects Montgomery against Churchill's utterly ignorant bunglings, which are quite terrifying. And incidentally, we should do a talk on that sometime, the stupidities of Churchill in both world wars. I mean, it is a never-ending list, a never-ending list. But back in World War I, as I say, what would have happened, and I finish at this point, this is the punchline. What would have happened had Teddy Roosevelt had his way in May 1915, and we had gone into World War I 2 years early? And remember, Roosevelt is also the opposite of Newton Baker, the Secretary for War. Baker drives Roosevelt crazy because he says, we cannot put units into the war until they are trained as part of the regular army, until they know how to use rifles, until they know how to dig trenches, until they know how to put barbed wire, until we have enough artillery to protect our infantry units. What is Theodore Roosevelt, this great president, the strategic genius's response to Newton Baker? The man is a pipe-smoking academic bound by red tape. Such people have no conception of real war, as I have. And that's all the old fool could say. Now, a couple of last points on this. Theodore Roosevelt dies in 1920. Within a decade, he has been deified on Mount Rushmore. 4 American presidents are carved in gigantic relief figures on a scale that even the Egyptian pharaohs could never dream of, on Mount Rushmore, using modern explosive techniques. It truly is an act of imperial grandeur, an act of imperial hubris. And who are these presidents? They are George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, perfectly understandable by today's standards,
Jefferson.
Exactly. Rather out of favor today, but again, a figure of enormous intellectual power and stature, not to mention the mastermind of the Louisiana Purchase. And who is the fourth? It is, of course, Teddy Roosevelt. Within a decade, this is all, it never seems to bother Franklin Roosevelt in the slightest, but to Americans in general, after World War II, this is seen as bizarre. Because Franklin Roosevelt has just won the greatest war in human history against some of the darkest militaristic forces in history. And he won it he went into the war very reluctantly. He organized the war extraordinarily efficiently and also humanely. And he won it very cost effectively. And he also saved the country from the Great Depression. Now, that's vast oversimplification, because, of course, FDR's great strength was being a world-class strategist in winning wars. His great weakness was being an economist. And, in fact, one of the great surprises I found when I was writing Cycles of Change, my history of American politics, was how U.S. economic recovery, it does not start in 1933 with the New Deal. It doesn't. Or if it does, it only splutters a bit and then stalls. And the 1937 Depression threatens to be almost as bad as the Great Depression at its worst, only 6 or 7 years earlier. But and that was no surprise to me. Though every liberal in America will deny those facts, everyone. But I had always assumed, and this is very much a British view and a Republican view too, and a free market view, that it's the flood of war orders from Britain and France that turn the tide around, lead to American industrial economic recovery in 1939. In other words, it comes after September 1939 when rearmament starts seriously in Britain and France, and only after World War I begins. But that's not true either. The recovery starts in November 1938, and it is already in full swing by March and April 1939. And the reason for it is very simple. And it is domestic. It has nothing to do with Europe or World War I at all. It is because for the first time since the Great Crash, there is a recovery of American consumer confidence, not consumer, business confidence, and investment confidence in American industry and business. And the reason for that is because there was a conservative victory in the 1938 midterm elections. There is now a cross-party coalition of Southern conservative and racist Democrats in the South and Republicans of all ilk in the North, who, whatever views they have on social legislation, however enlightened, are economically conservative, low tax, cut government spending people. And what they all agree on is they're not going to pass any more big spending experiments by the New Deal and by FDR. They, in fact, have an unlikely ally in the New Deal itself, and that is Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau, a German Jewish banker by background, so he is uniformly hated by all liberals for whom he isn't liberal enough. They think he's a big, bad, evil, conservative New York banker, and by all conservatives because they think he's a big, bad, evil, liberal New York Jew, right? And of course, he is Jewish and he is a banker. And he, not only is he Jewish, worse, he's German Jewish. So he appears at least not to have a sense of humor. But he actually emerges as a tremendously humane and heroic figure in World War II. He is the only major figure in the governments of the United States, Britain, or the Soviet Union who takes a serious effort, and it is a surprisingly successful one, to rescue Jews and other victims from the Holocaust and other victims of Nazi genocidal policies. And he works overtime on their behalf, whether they're Slavic, whether they're homosexuals, whether they're gypsies, who of course were a prime target for the Nazis. And he's a fascinating figure. He's also a fascinating figure because although people have written endless biographies about him, he's one of these curious people, and I actually find this very sympathetic, that you cannot make him sweet and lovable. He's heroic, he's admirable, he's moral, he's courageous. He even enjoys playing with his children. But he comes across as a stuffy, boring fellow, except to one man, Franklin Roosevelt. But that's a story for another time. But again, as I say, I'll finish here. There are many other places we can go in the discussion. But the bottom line is this. Theodore Roosevelt has become the icon for 40 years of muscular American neo-imperialism around the world, for not just carrying a big stick, but for using it. He's macho man. He's supposed to be a strategic genius. He is the inescapable, even if surprising, icon in 16 years of Republican administration, no, 20 years of Republican administrations under Ronald Reagan, the first President Bush, and the second President Bush. And yet he is, in reality, a dangerous and even contemptible buffoon. And had he had his way, 2 million American boys would have been dead by 1920, if not by 1917 or 1918. And the American century, as we know it at its best, would never have happened. We would have had an America after World War I that was exhausted by the bloodbath horrors of the war, as the British, French, and Germans were. The French turned towards civil war and despair and fascism. The Germans embraced Nazism. The British were so exhausted that they didn't even have the grip to keep their extraordinary claim on the empire anymore. They were even run between the wars by that greatest of all paradoxes, a genuinely kind, well-meaning British imperial statesman, Stanley Baldwin. Again, a much misunderstood figure, who I'm also working to rehabilitate at Churchill's expense. But that, of course, is also a story for another day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marty. And judging from the visuals of the claps, I think that everybody here is grateful to have had a chance to hear you just share your story and share your insights. I love the way that you're able to really cut through this problem that we often get when we try to impose narratives explaining how history happens with big, broad, black and white brushstrokes of judgment, where you're able to actually look at the individuals.
Exactly.
Yeah, and you're able to look at them and see the complexity behind many of the individuals who are mixed bags. And I think that there's a lot of insight and value that one can get from that. I personally have a lot of questions, but I think I'll just let it open right now for anybody who has questions to avoid chaos. I unfortunately don't have the chat fixed from last week. I'm so sorry that I didn't fix that. However, the different ways, most people have my contact info. They could send me a text message if they have a question for Marty. Or they could also raise their hand visually if you have your video on, and I could see you and call upon you to do that. And Martin, just last thing, I will get your book out to everybody, both who watches this on YouTube, because I'm going to have it, we have a description box so people can look at your book and order it.
Oh, bless you. And for everyone there, even if you disagree with it, but of course, especially if there are points you do agree with, stick it at any Facebook or chat box you can find, because these things came out 5 years ago. They sank without a trace at the time. I'm discovering, as I think you either have, Stephen, or will discover, there's a curious afterlife in these things. You put out things, they sink without trace, or you think they do. And then they do bubble back up in unexpected places, more or less positively, but in ways you could never have anticipated at the time. So that seems to be happening with my cycles of change. But I would very much appreciate feedback from everybody on that.
Great.